Hey, Dean. So this is what we're doing on the podcast now. Before we actually get into anything, we're just going to talk about the reviews that we got over the past week. Is that cool?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, great. So since we pleaded with people last week to give us reviews on iTunes, one more person has, and it's very uplifting. So we're at a 4 out of 5 stars total. Just going to give you the rundown. Just give you the stats here. So that's pretty good. I mean, I feel good about 4 out of 5 stars. I think it's actually not that good, but I don't think our podcast is really worth that, but I'm okay with saying it. It's fine.
I appreciate other people judging it that way.
Yeah, me too. I think that's good. Okay, so we have a new review. It's by a person, username Anabaptish, like Anabaptist-ish, or their name is Tish and they're Anabaptist.
Yeah, or their first name is Tish and their last name is Anabap.
Yeah, that's possible. Well, so this user gave us a 5 out of 5 stars, which I am very thankful for. How nice. Okay, so get ready for this. This is a great title. This is the title of the review. Okay. Rare only ? Real Christian Left podcast. Okay, so that's right. You heard it right from iTunes. We are first of all rare, which is very good.
Yeah.
And we are the maybe only real Christian Left podcast. I don't know if there are any other Christian Left podcasts out there. There probably are, but they're not as real as us.
Yeah, they're Democrats out there.
Yeah, just some liberals. We keep it very real, though.
Yeah, very real. Very real and very rare around here.
Real and rare.
We don't cook this podcast. It's bleeding when it gets to your headphones.
Pink in the middle.
That's right.
Gross. I don't.
Yeah, I don't eat meat. So actually, very gross. Let's get away from that.
I can't even think
fast.
about it. That's disgusting. Okay. Anyways, okay. So this is the what they say in the comment. Some neat and well-informed Christian left ideas and information here. They've been improving production quality and bringing on interesting guests. So that's good.
Yeah,
that's
that proves our commitment. Actually, that if you donate to the Patreon, we'll improve the quality.
Every single week, it gets better because we get more Patreon subscribers. We got 2 today, and it's better because of it.
That's
already.
Right. Thank you, by the way. That's it still blows me away that people actually appreciate what we're even saying on this, because I have such a good time doing it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like maybe I feel like I shouldn't get paid to have fun. Capitalism has like driven that into me, that I should actually be like hating myself if I'm making money. So I don't know. Thanks for not making me feel that way. I really like that.
It's good. I appreciate it. It's important to note, though, this comment here. It begins with some neat and well-informed Christian left ideas and information here, which does mean that there are some unneat and some uninformed Christian left ideas, which is true, which is 100% true.
It is true. Yeah, there are dirty Christian ideas on this podcast.
Some real dirty, gross stuff in here.
Yeah, garbage takes, and then there are also some uninformed takes.
Yeah. Like some that we just make up on the spot.
Yeah, we're going to do it real soon.
All right, here it goes. Here it goes. Right, that's the Keenan and Kel thing, right?
Yeah. Coolio, cue the Coolio. Hey Matt.
Hey Dean.
How's it going on this fine episode of the Magnificast?
It's going great, man. It's a good episode. This is gonna be the best episode.
That's high praise, but I have to agree.
In the last few episodes, we've been like hitting all of the heavy topics. We talked about Lenin, and that was like intense. And we talked about the Communist Party of the Philippines, and that was also intense. But this week, I think we should do something a little more chill. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's very cool.
Okay, so this is what I was thinking. the entire podcast is like basically predicated on the assumption that everyone that listens to this is already a Christian or is already a leftist, or they're like at least open to either of those things. So I thought it might be a good idea, like if we did some groundwork in this episode that explains like socialism, communism, and like how it is or is not compatible with Christianity. Do that heavy lifting for our wonderful listeners, huh?
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds really good. I wish someone would have done that for me. So
yeah, me too. So like maybe these are like these are the things that you'll have to explain to your dad when you go home and talk to him about how much you love Karl Marx in this podcast right
on the 4th of July in particular.
Yeah,
it's coming up, so it's time to break out that reading list.
That's right. Dad, have you ever read Althusser? You would really like it.
Why, yes, and here are my objections.
Whoa. Like really real class conscious dad voice.
Yeah, that's right. That's the only dad voice I'm going to have one day when I'm a dad.
All right, well, since I'm like so brainwashed into my leftist ideology, I scoured the internet and like just looked at some Christian blogs to see like what people had, like what objections that these folks would come up with against socialism or against communism. Turns out they don't know the difference between those two things, so no big deal. But anyways, I came up with five main objections. I think that if we talk through them together, maybe it would be like a good starting place for somebody if like you didn't do a master's degree and a PhD that focused on Karl Marx.
Yeah, that sounds good. I like that a lot. Okay, so what was like a prime objection? What's the first thing you got on your list there?
Yeah, the first objection. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of a spoiler alert here. All of the objections are actually very stupid, except the very first one, which I think is good. So the first objection that I found amongst a lot of Christian commentators is that communism and socialism both are predicated on a materialist metaphysics, and that could be a problem for Christianity.
Yeah, quality objection. That's something like even good, faithful Christians that are on the left have to deal with.
I mean, like, literally, when we were talking about Lenin last week,
yeah.
he made the assumption that, like, if you just figured materialism out, you wouldn't be a Christian. So if Lenin thinks it's true and also Christian bloggers think it's true, it must be, like, a real objection.
Yeah, that's a horseshoe theory, for sure.
That's right. Well, okay, so materialism is important because it is a metaphysic. So metaphysics make assumptions about like what is real and what is like the most real in the world. Materialism is in stark contrast to another metaphysic called idealism. Idealism posits that like ideas are sort of like the groundwork of reality, where materialism says that like no, like real existing matter is the groundwork of reality. And both those things are really philosophically nuanced. But materialism is really important for Marx because he thinks that if you describe the world through a materialist sort of lens, you can get to a type of political economy that is actually good for people.
Yeah, that sounds like a good summary, actually. Well done. I was interested to see how this would go, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, that was my teacher voice too.
I like it. That's a good teacher voice. It's not the same as class conscious dad voice, but it's got its own charm.
Yeah, if you want to know more about materialism and Marx, he has a thing to read called The German Ideology. That's where you should go for that kind of conversation. Yeah, but materialism is definitely a problem for Christianity because in Christianity, we have this whole like spirit thing going on, and that's a complication for materialism because in materialism, I don't know, you don't believe in things like spirits or the non-material. I don't know, Dean, what do you think about this objection? How would you resolve this?
Yeah, I mean, okay. I think it's too quick for some Christians to actually move directly to replying to this kind of objection by saying, just because we disagree about, I don't know, the final destination of human beings or like the existence of God or whatever, like that doesn't mean that we can't borrow from Marx's analysis, etc. Like that's true, and we'll talk about that hopefully soon. But I think it's actually important to wrestle with this tension because, as you were referring to the Lenin episode last week, like it is a real thing. I mean, Marxists are, Orthodox Marxists are atheists. And if you're not an atheist, you're not an Orthodox Marxist, which is fine. But it's something to kind of work through. So, yeah, what do you think about that? Like, as a kind of real challenge to, like, all things that get called religions, what do you think sort of materialism, kind of maybe on the one hand offers to religion as a critical voice, and then on the other hand gets wrong about religion?
Yeah, well, what it offers to religion that I think is good is it gives a way of systematically understanding material injustice in the world. Most religions have some type of sentiment that says that you should care about the poor or something. I mean, right. I don't know. That's not a controversial statement, right? I don't think it is.
Yeah.
But figuring out who the poor is or who the oppressed is significantly easier if you know about materialism and you can understand like that the material conditions are not just like the immediate relationship between people and their property or something, that there's like a larger structural thing going on there. So materialism is helpful in that way, that it gives you a way to understand systemic problems. It offers a challenge when it comes to all of the other stuff. Like, I don't know, Christological stuff. Like if you have to make claims about like what happened to Jesus when he died and then rose again, and like when he ascends. It's weird because on the one hand, like the resurrection story is a super materialist story. Jesus is crucified, he's like put in a tomb, and like when he comes back, it is his like material body that is there that has the holes in it, right? So there's like there is a real materialism in Christianity that we can find there, but there's like other weird stuff that is harder to deal with, like I don't know, like the ascension is like kind of weird because matter doesn't usually just kind of fly into the sky. When Jesus talks about demon possession, that's kind of weird too, because demons are, I don't know, seemingly immaterial. So I don't know. There are some definite challenges. There are also some like I don't know. I'm not like a biblical scholar in the least, so there are different ways of reading some of those more spiritual geared stories that make materialism a little bit more palatable, but there's still probably some challenges. I don't know. Dean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. And in terms of a kind of helpful critical voice, I guess, one tool that materialism offers to Christians is forcing Christians to really confront what conversations they're having that make a material difference and what conversations they're having that actually don't. So, for example, you were just talking about things like Christology and, I don't know, what people think about the resurrection, etc. And it's not that those conversations are uninteresting or, totally unimportant. I guess some of them are probably important. But at a real kind of basic level, there is something about those conversations that divide, say, for example, the working class from each other in ways that are actually very bad. And prevent them from dealing with the material problems that are right in front of them. So, whether or not you baptize babies or something, that's an interesting kind of cultural conversation to have. But at the end of the day, baptizing a baby or not baptizing a baby doesn't make any difference to whether or not all the people in the world are getting exploited by a global capitalist situation. So in the grand scheme of things, it helps to contextualize the importance of some of those conversations and debates. So, I don't know, in my own life, I think materialism actually pushed me away from caring as much about theological problems as I used to. And I'm, thankful for that. Not that I don't care about them, and not that I don't appreciate the kind of good work that some people do with them, but I don't know, I think it's just helpful to inform that work and as it relates to contextualizing it in a way.
Yeah, I think at the very least, materialism is a mode of critique that you can just kind of pilfer and use, even though you might not have a strong commitment to the metaphysics.
That's the Augustinian way, right? You're plundering the Egyptians for their tools.
That's right.
Their gold, whatever it is.
It's a very that's right. That's a very good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it is. I also think, though, on the other hand, like I sort of said earlier, I often feel kind of ambivalent when Christians take up this relationship to Marxism and materialism in particular, where it's like, well, we can just adopt kind of the mode of critique without feeling the need to take on board all this other stuff. And I obviously agree with that because I have a podcast with you about Christianity and leftist politics. So at like a very existential level, I think that that's right. But there's a triumphalistic way that some people read that, where it's like, yeah, well, Orthodox Marxists are like idiots when it comes to religion, so we don't have to deal with that. And, a lot of Orthodox Marxists actually do have an impoverished view of religion. But I don't know. There's like a lot to sort out there. And that objection to Marxism among some conservative Christians, I think, is at least one that's worth like playing with and, not allowing it to win as an objection, but just allowing it to kind of trouble the relationship between the left and Christianity in some ways.
So, okay, conservative Christian bloggers out there, materialism, that's a good concern.
Yeah, I mean, you're wrong to be worried about it, but that's the best one of all the problems.
That's right. Okay, so here's the second one. This is something that this is where the conservative values of some of these Christian bloggers really shine through. So it's awesome. Okay, it's kind of phrased like in a weird way, but I'll kind of explain it and you'll get what it means. Okay, so a few of these bloggers based this objection off of a I don't know, a decontextualized quote from 2 Thessalonians. It's one line. The quote from 2 Thessalonians is, "The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat." Right? So first of all, again, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I know better than to take one line from a letter and just to be like, so what do you think about that, communists?
Yeah.
So basically the idea here is that summed up in this like the stupid decontextualized Bible verse, what you get is like the idea, I guess, or the assumption that people like in a hypothetical, I guess, ideal like socialist society could just like kind of mooch off the government and not work and not contribute, and that should make conservative Christians like very I don't know, nervous about it. Like everyone needs to work, like everyone has to contribute or something. This like sort of idea of like personal individual responsibility.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like this seems to me like a conservative value that's actually just sort of like thinly veiled with a Bible verse.
Yeah.
And it actually is like a Christian objection.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's
What do
exactly
you think?
Right. Well, I think that's right, and I also think that the biggest thing is just centering on even the term work. Like, I don't know, like you, I'm also not a biblical scholar, and I hesitate to ever talk about the Bible because I'm almost always wrong. And there are a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me. But at the end of the day, I do know that ancient Greece, or ancient Rome, is not the same as contemporary global capitalism. So whatever Paul meant by like working and eating is not even a little bit the same as like working and eating as it is now, or how those relationships might play out. And I think one of the most dangerous ways to read the Bible is basically to try to lift these principled stances out of, I don't know, a really weird society and a kind of burgeoning community of Christians that was trying to figure out what the heck it was supposed to be doing. Trying to lift those principles and then apply them to a world that is organized by like oil and mass industrial production and commodification of everything. They just don't translate in the same exact way, and it's a mistake to assume that if Paul were alive today or whatever, he would think that work is the same exact thing as it is now. I mean, like I said, I don't know what he thought, but it probably wasn't, he probably wasn't thinking about you like going to your Dilbert job, from 9 to 5 and then going home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually in this situation, I think the right materialist question to ask is like, okay, if that's the case, then like what was the relationship between the people in this letter to their labor? Like, did they own the means of production? Right. What's going on? Yeah, It's also, I don't know, this idea of like social individual responsibility that everyone has to work, I think is also kind of an anti-Christian idea.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Especially if you really do believe in like I don't know, I don't want to get too like cheesy and evangelical, I guess, but if you really believe in like the self-pouring out and like canonic love of Jesus Christ as something that you like don't actually deserve, then like this is, I don't know, doesn't work.
Yeah, or even another amateur theologian point here. To think of it in terms of kind of eschatological life, you know, if at the end of all of human society or whatever, you really believe that you'll live in a society that kind of mirrors in some ways a world without the fall or something. It's like, well, what do we learn about what happens to human beings in the biblical myth of the fall? It turns out they have to work, and before they didn't. So
yeah, that's a good point, man. Yeah, no, that's good.
If you're living an eschatologically informed life, then presumably you wouldn't assume the conditions of the fall are the things that you should be patterning your community around.
Right. Plus, before the fall, all animals are vegetarians. So
that's right.
So that's why you shouldn't eat meat.
Yeah. For a time in my life, that was the reason I didn't eat meat. It's not the reason that I don't eat meat now, but there was a time that it was.
Yeah. I don't eat meat now because people who work in like meat packing factories like can't go to the bathroom.
Yeah,
like they don't get bathroom breaks.
Same.
So I don't know. The material conditions are bad, and like you shouldn't eat meat because like those are crappy companies. Like all companies are crappy, but those ones specifically. Okay,
so whatever. Socialism, I don't know, on this view, stops people from being good for whatever reason. That makes no sense to me at all.
Yeah, that's completely bizarre, I think. Okay, so we've taken care of these first two objections. Here's the third one. Okay, if this last objection was like a conservative value thinly veiled in a Bible verse, the third one is even more so. So a pretty common objection to communism, socialism, Marxist philosophy, I don't know, all of those things. Okay, I just kind of jammed those things together, which is not really very good. But like the kind of places I'm taking these ideas from do it. Maybe we can talk about what those things are specifically later, but for now, okay, these are the objections. So the third objection is that like in the Ten Commandments it says, "Thou shalt not steal." So sort of like the underlying logic or objection here is that in a socialist kind of political economy, the government steals your private property, I guess. Like they steal like what belongs to you, I guess, in the forms of taxation or in the forms of like the appropriation of land or something.
Right.
That is again like not really what's going on, I think, in the Ten Commandments or like anywhere in the entire Bible, but that's kind of what it comes down to, is that like it's weird because it seems like the objection that many Christians come up with at this point, it like has an absolute belief that private property is like something that's like that no one can transgress, that it's like an inalienable right. And I think that is some pretty wrong-headed thinking.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also just a huge mistake in terms of importing modern private property categories onto whatever was happening in the Bible again. Like, it's the same kind of error that people, I think, make with respect to just being lazy about thinking about Paul and whatever the heck he's talking about. Like, if you do read the Old Testament, which I know a little bit about, having taken some classes on it, it's... It just isn't the case that private property is respected in the same way that it's respected in modernity, where it's a kind of literally an inalienable right. You can't get rid of it. And, you know, I just think it's a mistake to assume that private property was ever held in the same way in all parts of history as it is today. I don't know, human rights like didn't exist before modernity, so the right to property was not like a thing on anybody's radar.
Yeah. It also reminds me, though, I mean, this objection reminds me directly of a line from the Communist Manifesto, which is the best manifesto, actually. That I think is good. So this is probably Dean committing the same sin of like importing the idea of property rights, but I think it's more of a response to the conservative logic than just to like the biblical position or whatever. Anyways, Marx in the Communist Manifesto says private property is always already done away with for 9/10 of the population. This is like kind of like a hot take that Marx gives. So Marx in the manifesto is actually doing the same thing that we're doing here. He's like laying out like bourgeois objections to communism, and he's just like sort of like rebuking them with like a pretty strong rhetorical flourish, and it's awesome. Anyways, but the point here is that like the bourgeoisie are like upset because the communists are going to come take the private property away from them. And Marx is like, yeah, but for most people don't have private property to begin with, and yes, we will take yours.
Yeah. And here's actually a good way in which the problem gets inverted with respect to the objection here that the government is stealing your property or whatever when they tax you, because communists and anarchists have a lot of disagreements, but one thing that is kind of a common thread is a good Proudhon line that property is theft, right? And you get the same thing in Marx, though, put in different sort of language, that basically what capitalists are constantly doing is stealing all of the extra value that gets created by the people that they exploit, by the laborers that they exploit.
That's right.
So if you were really upset about things getting stolen, there are compelling reasons in leftist politics to assume that that's exactly why you shouldn't like capitalism, because it institutionalizes thievery, right? So if you're an anarchist, it's thievery because all private property is stealing, because private property doesn't properly belong to a private person. If you're a communist, there's another way of talking about stealing in terms of stealing people's labor and the work that they do and the products that they contribute to. And I think it's just like an interesting way of, if you were really upset about, the value of stealing, then there's no reason that you shouldn't assume that leftists have something to say about that.
Yeah, right. This kind of reminds me of a really like formative moment in my career as a communist. When I was getting my master's degree, I was in this class that was on like Marxist philosophy, and it was a great class. Anyways, somebody like it was at a school in the Midwest, so of course somebody asked this question about private property and theft, and like don't communists just like want to steal your stuff or whatever. Anyways, and the instructor, who was an amazing person, said like basically what you just said, but also made this other great point that was like listen, if there was like a communist uprising like right now, like there's not, but if there was, like they're not coming for you. They're not coming for your property, because like guess what? Like you basically don't own anything. You're a college student. Right. You're like, you're at least $10,000 in debt or something. Like you don't own a single thing. Like they're going for people who actually like own capital. Yeah. And like who own the means of production. Like they don't want your toothbrush. They don't want your like crappy house. Like maybe it's a nice house. I don't know. But like they're not what they're after. They're after like something like much more important. Maybe a good example of this thing about property is the Grenfell fire that happened really recently in the UK. Basically there's a fire and a lot of people lost their homes and their lives, and that is very terrible. However, in response to these people who now don't have homes, Jeremy Corbyn just suggested that, like, I don't know, those people should like occupy the empty apartments around London. So like basically the idea though is that like the people that are in need are more important than like stupid arbitrary property rights. Yeah,
that's also an extremely Christian concept. So the early church thought of property in those terms in a lot of cases. There are a lot of authors who treat property with suspicion, and they do it on the grounds that it's actually stealing from the poor. So St. John of Chrysostom is like the one that always comes to mind for me. But basically what they'll say is, if you're a rich person and you have extra coats in your closet that you don't wear, that's theft. You stole that from the poor. Even though you never met a poor person and like took a coat off their back or whatever. That's the logic that basically plays out. And even in the biblical narrative, you get that same kind of thing going on. Like, there are so many problems with basing politics off the Old Testament. People should not do it. Please don't do that. However, there's a cool thing in the Old Testament. A lot of cool things. But there's this whole sort of jubilee mechanic where like every 7 years, basically all these debts just get canceled and all the property that people are supposed to have accumulated just like reset and go back to normal. And that's supposed to happen all the time. And there are all these weird like controls on property getting too out of control. So like you're not supposed to cut the corners of your field because they actually belong to the poor, even though you cultivate them and they're technically on your land. So, you know, like the Judeo-Christian tradition has just never appreciated private property in the same way that moderns do, even though moderns are Christians, so I guess I shouldn't say that. But there's a very early precedent for Christians to basically support exactly what Jeremy Corbyn is saying on their own grounds, you know, not even in whatever, the grounds of the Labour Party or something.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think so much of that is just imported into Christianity from capitalism, like that ideology,
and vice versa. I mean, Christianity did build capitalism, but it's a complicated relationship.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the next objection that we're going to talk about is that Marxism is something that encourages envy through the mechanism of class war. Marx's philosophy of history is one that is based on like the tensions of like class antagonism, that there are always classes pitted against one another, and that in capitalism we see all of the classes sort of congeal into these two polar opposites of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And I guess some might say that like playing up the antagonism between these two classes might make one class envious of another. But that seems like a really weird articulation of that problem.
Yeah.
Dean, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, the only way I can understand the objection is to say that Marxism as a discourse would maybe encourage people who are members of lower classes to be envious of those who are members of higher classes or whatever, rich classes. So then the whole motivation is basically that you just like want their crap. And so it would be a politics of resentment. And that's like, politics of resentment are bad, but that's actually not what Marxism is, I don't think.
Yeah, not at all.
It's interesting because this is, in part, the implicit interpretation in some of Catholic social teaching. So there's a kind of notorious doctrine in Catholic social teaching called class harmony, where basically they were like, well, we don't want to abolish classes, we just want everybody to like be buds and kind of, you know, take up their spot in a healthy functioning society, and there's no reason that the classes should hate each other and envy each other. But I think what Catholic social teaching misunderstands really fundamentally is that what Marx is doing is not articulating or not creating a kind of hatred between the classes, but articulating a conflict that is already present. Whether or not the two classes, you know, genuinely hate one another in terms of like feelings or something is sort of beside the point. The real point is that there are structural mechanics that make these two classes clash in significant ways for their own kind of survival. So if you're a good capitalist, like you've got to exploit as many workers as you can to make as much profit as you can, because really, you know, you've got to envy your neighbor capitalists so that you can kind of keep the pace with them or outpace them or whatever. And then if you're on the other side of that conflict, you're constantly getting your labor sort of stolen, whether you like it or not. I mean, some people don't mind it, but it's not about whether or not you actively hate them or resent them or whatever. Marx is just sort of noting like a mechanic that happens, like the class conflict is there. And I think that's like a really important thing that gets misunderstood by a lot of critics of Marx.
Yeah, he's not making class warfare or whatever up. He's describing something that is happening, which is like one of Marx's like most important roles is like descriptor.
Yeah.
But even more though, Herbert McCabe in that article we read a few weeks ago says this, but I think it's worth saying here too, that like the point of being a communist isn't to like bring more people under like subjugation. Like the point isn't to flip the roles in society. Right. The point is to work through through these political economies and get to like a just political economy. And not to like, I don't know, just like get revenge on your enemies or something like that.
Yeah. That's right. And another thing McCabe says in that article, which is also very right and good, is that I'm going to just repeat the same logical argument I made in the last point, but basically, like, if you're worried about envy, then you should be upset about capitalism, not socialism, because it's capitalism that encourages you to compete, right? To be envious of one another, to try to outdo one another and outpace one another, and always be worried that someone else is going to, if you're not working as hard as you can, someone else is going to work harder, and they'll take your job, or they'll, outmaneuver you in the market or something. And I think that's the strangest thing to me about that kind of an objection, is that, like, capitalism really breeds resentment, not just among classes, but even among people within classes. The bourgeoisie will protect itself, but it also is suspicious of each other.
Well, I mean, that's how like, I don't know, consumerism like works, right? You have to be envious, like,
that's right,
like to like produce that desire of like wanting something ridiculous.
Yeah, it's like anyone who's ever been to high school like understands how capitalism basically corners you into being envious.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, here's the fifth objection, and I think it's an interesting one, but there's a really great response that Marx himself has. Okay, so the final objection is that, like, socialism in some way destroys families, or like is not good for family life, which as we all know, evangelical Christians love it. They love families. They're like all about family values. So I guess the idea is there's something about like the socialist arrangement of like egalitarianism that makes family life degrade or something. I don't know. On this point, though, there's actually some really funny responses from Marx himself on this very point. So I guess I'll just read it. I don't know.
Yeah.
If the objection is that socialism destroys families, Marx says this: the bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Okay, so maybe this objection is right. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of modern industry, all family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the whole bourgeoisie chorus. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion than that the lot being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. Okay, so I guess in the last two objections, it's been like, well, no, communism doesn't do that. Actually, capitalism does. And I think the same point remains here, based on this quote from Marx, is that socialism doesn't destroy families. Actually, the bourgeois family, in which people are instrumentalized to either like produce or reproduce, or like bring in money for the family, is already a pretty degraded family as it is. So maybe that should be destroyed.
Yeah, there's like two things I think about this. So the first thing is that, like you were just saying, capitalism is the thing that undermines family. So I find it so odd that so many conservatives align themselves to capitalism, because if you're a real conservative, you're probably also upset about things like, I don't know, whatever is happening in culture that gets marketed to, say, your children, for example. So like I knew a lot of evangelicals who were upset that in rated R films there would be partial nudity or swearing or violence, or I don't know, they weren't that worried about violence, but all the other stuff, or they'd be worried about the availability of internet pornography or something. But the thing is, all those things exist by virtue of how effective they are in a capitalist society. Like, it makes a lot of money to be able to do those things, and that's why people do them. So if you felt like your family was getting screwed over by the moral degradation of your society, it's like capitalism, not liberals, that you would have to blame for that. But the other thing that bothers me is, like, so I don't agree with that critique, because I think conservatives are wrong about a lot of things, and that's one of them. Like, being paranoid about your family is not a good thing. But another way that this is sort of frustrating to me is I feel like there's a deep kind of anti-family sentiment in Christianity itself.
Oh, yeah.
And that's important to explore. Like, Jesus is not exactly family friendly. If you look at a lot of things he says, like at one point, like his mom and siblings come and they're like, "Hey, what's up?" And he's like, "Oh, these people, like, that's not my mom and brothers. These other people are my mom and brothers." Like he builds like a totally different family apart from the kind of blood ties that he was born into.
Right.
And that's like a really radical and difficult thing that I think it's safe to say Christianity has actually never fully grasped or embodied, except in maybe like very minor moments. So, yeah, I don't know. Socialism destroys the family. It's like, on the one hand, well, first of all, capitalism destroys the family. But on the other hand, also, like, the family as we know it is maybe not even an institution that we should be thinking about as something to preserve, per se.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting point. Huh. Well, all right. Yeah, there's some hard stuff in the New Testament about even getting married.
Yeah, I mean, I'm married, and I don't have kids, but I do have 2 cats, and also, like, I love my mom and my, sister and my, whatever, my siblings.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I get it. Like, family weighs you down, It's really hard to do the radical things that Jesus wants you to do when you got to worry about taking care of your family or having your family take care of you, or, all the complications that happen in family life.
Right.
It's one thing that, this is a weird aside, I'm just going to go with it, though. That's what this podcast is for. It's one thing that I appreciate about, weirdly enough, sort of the role of priests in society, Catholic priests in particular, who are celibate and have no, biological families. So I always think of Daniel Berrigan when I think about celibacy, and Philip Berrigan too, but they, famously, if you don't know who they are, they're 2 Catholic priests who broke into, a military office with a bunch of other people as well, 9 of them altogether. And they stole these Vietnam documents, draft documents, and they took them out in a parking lot and they burned it with homemade napalm and said these prayers over it. And then a bunch of them got arrested and some of them ran away. Daniel Berrigan famously fled the FBI for a long time, and they finally caught him and whatever. They all had their own trials, but what's so crazy to me about that is, if Daniel Berrigan was, a regular old family man with, kids to worry about and all that kind of stuff, it would be, really hard to break into a Vietnam draft office and then take all these records and burn them so that they, literally stopped people from going to Vietnam. And by virtue of that kind of freedom, there's something really kind of interesting and Christ-like about that I think is important for Christians to at least leave the door open to that kind of experience. So I don't know. It's not an argument for or against the family per se, but it's a complicated relationship that Christianity really does have to family as an institution, even in one of its most conservative expressions, like the Roman Catholic Church or whatever.
Yeah, huh? That's good.
I hope so.
Yeah, can we do one more that I didn't write down?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. I guess another objection I think that I've at least heard in real life before is that to be a Marxist or to be a communist is to be not to be an American, or not to have that sense of patriotism that is correct for people.
Right.
And it's weird how that gets wrapped up with Christianity so much. I mean, this is such a I don't know, only surface level comment on the the combined powers of patriotism and Christianity. I mean, we could say a lot about that probably, but those two things do get combined a lot, and it's sort of interesting, and I think a problem for sure. I know, does your sanctuary or whatever have an American flag in it? Why?
Right.
That's the Stanley Hauerwas point or whatever, or the John Howard Yoder point. Anyways, so sometimes the objection to socialism, to Marxism, to communism is that it's like not patriotic, that you can't love your country and be a communist. And I'm here to say that that's true. That's like a really that's a really good objection. Actually, you guys are right. You got us there. From the Manifesto again, which is like basically the Bible at this point. Marx says the communists are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. So yeah, that's true. There's a real anti-patriotism and anti-nationalism. Yeah, man, that's I think a right assessment.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
But I think there's also, I bring it up because I think it's important to disentangle Christianity from nationalism, because it's such a toxic mix of things.
Yeah, and not only that, like, it's a clearly pervasive force, especially in American society, probably more than any other. I don't know, maybe that's not true, but significantly in the United States, I think the majority of people who, not only just voted for Donald Trump, but voted at all, would probably identify as Christians. And the people who defend Donald Trump are primarily Christians. And the people who also can't seem to imagine a politics outside of the left are also Christians. And a lot of those arguments boil down to patriotism in one way or another. So either you support Donald Trump because he represents some kind of nationalist dream for you to make America great again, or you fully believed in Hillary Clinton because you're like a real patriot who cares about your country or something. And like both of those approaches are actually mirrored bad ways of approaching the problem. I think if you're a good Christian and a good leftist, you wouldn't fall into either of those kind of sides.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I also think it's a really it's a cool note too to say that like the proletariat. So this is to reference Marx again, that like the proletariat has to become like the leading class of the nation and must constitute itself as the nation, but not as like a bourgeois sense of the word.
Right.
And I really like that because so I'm not a Marxist-Leninist. Sorry. But
sorry, Derek. Please don't listen to this episode.
Sorry, Derek. I have like sympathies, but it's just like not quite my jam.
Yeah, I get it.
But that's I think that's a cool formulation, that it's like it has to form a nation, but not in the bourgeois sense. Insofar as like Marxism is not always like a hard statism, I guess, is like what appeals to me about that.
Yeah.
So that there's this kind of special formation that the nation has in this way of thinking, that it's not about like pride, I guess, necessarily, but about like I don't know, a just arrangement of society where the people who, that's right. The people who do the work own the means of production.
Right. Also, I just want to take this opportunity to actually make a quick jab at Hauerwas, since you brought him up and mentioned him.
Jab that guy.
And Yoder and others. So the thing is about nationalism, it's completely true and good and right that Christianity opposes nationalism and should oppose it, and we should all keep driving that home, especially in nations where Christianity and nationalism are seemingly inextricably linked in frustrating ways. However, with that long preamble, however, I think that sometimes that actually precludes moving one step further to real class-conscious politics. Yeah. And you see that in people like Hauerwas and Yoder. So they're very quick to denounce the worship of the United States as idolatry or whatever, and that's good. But it's also like, okay, but what are you doing to really fund, actual organized alternatives? And sometimes I think that the nationalism critique, while being good, almost gets kind of fetishized or fixated on in a way that precludes critiquing the structures of capital as such, because that's really the ultimate kind of problem, I think. As bad as nationalism is, capitalism isn't national anymore. It's transnational, it's global, and the resistance to it has to be transnational and global too. And I think if you resist capitalism, you kind of are forced into a position of anti-nationalism. But the opposite isn't true. If you're opposed to nationalism, you're not necessarily opposed to capitalism, which, I don't know. That's a troubling fate for a lot of Christians, in my experience.
Yeah. Man, I'm really interested in like that question about like, I don't know, nationalism, especially, sorry, man, it's always all going to come back around to the Philippines because like that's my one interest in the world right now.
Yeah, dude.
But like that question's played out in a pretty interesting way there.
Yeah, they're the Christians for national liberation.
Right, and like the NDF is about national liberation too. And well, okay, so if I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, I'm also definitely not a Maoist. But again, like I can have sympathies, I suppose. And the Maoist answer to this question is pretty interesting too, since it's a formulation of Marxism-Leninism. That has to deal with like colonialism and post-colonialism. It has to figure out a way to deal with the idea of the nation when the nation is so fraught with problems. Like national liberation is important because you might have to side with like sort of like the national bourgeoisie to like oust the global bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I know it is very complicated in that way. But I think it's different in a place like the U.S. Which is the colonizer rather than the colonized.
Yeah.
So maybe it's more a strategic question.
Yeah, I think it is totally. I guess the reason I bring up the Philippines is just like to make it complicated, and not to,
And also just to bring up the Philippines because always worth bringing.
Yeah,
up.
Exactly. That's right.
CNL international sponsors of this podcast.
I wish that was true.
Yeah,
I mean,
too.
I would do it for free.
We should reverse that relationship. Actually, we should be sponsors of the CNL.
Yeah, that's true. I want the CNL to be like an international thing.
Yeah, CIL, Christians for International Liberation.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's do it. Let's build it.
So sign up on our Patreon to fund this new revolutionary effort.
Yeah, it's like in the same way that we don't have national or universal health care, but we could have like universal GoFundMe.
Yeah.
We could do the same with Marxism.
Yeah, that's right. The revolution will be crowdfunded.
It won't, by the way. Don't think
actually,
that. It's not going to get crowdfunded.
Okay, well, maybe in conclusion, I think what you can take away from these objections and our responses to them is when someone says, yeah, man, but communism does this bad thing, you can just be like, yeah, but actually, capitalism does that bad thing. And they will be astounded and shaken and convert to
that's right.
Marxism at that point.
That's how it's happened in every interaction that I've ever had. Online and offline, actually.
That's right. Speaking of converting to Marxism, if that's a thing that you actually convert to, you should think about converting to being a Patreon subscriber for us, or following us on Twitter, or leaving us a thing on iTunes, and we'll probably read it and make fun of your name or be confused about it. That's kind of our thing. That's what we do. That's our brand. All right, here's the illogical spoon to play us out as always.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was blowing in the lights of the downtown.